Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the podcast that really tries to cut through the noise and give you the core understanding of big topics fast.
Yeah, get straight to the point.
Exactly. Today we're diving into how societies, trying to nudge businesses towards being more sustainable, tackling those big environmental problems. Think of it as your quick guide to the basic tools they have.
And for this one, we've looked at quite a range of stuff. Academic lecture notes, news articles, reports from economic organizations, the works.
Right. And the goal is really to pull all these different threads together, synthesizing them into clear insights for you.
Insights you can actually use, hopefully.
So we've basically got three kind of core questions guiding us today. First, what's the fundamental economic reason we sometimes end up, damaging the environment?
Even when we know better, yeah.
Right. Second, what are the main types of tools governments and other groups use to push for sustainability?
The actual mechanisms.
Yeah. And third, and this is a big one, if these tools are out there and there seems to be this, scientific and economic agreement on needing action, why does it often feel like we're not making faster progress?
It's a fair question. Where do we start?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that basic economic principle.
Okay, so let's talk about Adam Smith's invisible hand. You've probably heard the term.
Sure.
The basic idea, and our BBC and YouTube sources explain this well, is that in a free market, prices are signals. They tell us what people value, how hard something is to make.
Right, they communicate information.
Exactly. And this whole process, it kind of naturally guides the market toward a balance, an equilibrium, without needing someone to dictate things.
Prices coordinate everything, more or less. And here's the kicker for the environment.
This is where it gets tricky. We run into negative externalities.
Okay, define that for us.
So our lecture notes define these as costs. Real costs that land on someone who wasn't part of the transaction, a third party. And crucially, the person or company causing that cost doesn't compensate them for it.
Okay. Like pollution.
Pollution is the classic example. Think of a factory. It makes widgets, sells them. The price covers its labor, materials, maybe electricity.
It's private costs.
It's private costs, yes. But if it pumps out smoke that causes, say, respiratory problems for people living nearby, those healthcare costs, maybe lost work days, they're real costs generated by the factory's activity.
But they're not on the factory's bill.
Nope, they're external. They're not in the price of the widget. So you could almost say the price tag is lying, right? Doesn't reflect the full cost, including that environmental damage or health impact.
I see. So the market price is incomplete. It's missing a crucial piece of information about the true cost.
Precisely. And because these negative externalities, these hidden costs, aren't in the price, well, our sources point out that people tend to produce or consume too much of whatever's causing them.
Because it seems cheaper than it actually is, once you factor in those external damages.
Exactly. And that leads to what economists call market failure. The invisible hand doesn't guide us to the best overall outcome for society because it's, blind to these external costs.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So that's the underlying problem, the why. The market, left totally alone, messes this up. So what do we do about it? How do we fix this failure?
Well, according to the policy documents we reviewed, the answer lies in policy interventions, measures designed specifically to correct these market failures.
To step in where the market falls short.
Right. The goal is usually to reduce how much we consume or produce the things causing these negative externalities. And these measures tend to fall into a few main buckets.
All right, let's get into those buckets. What are the main strategies?
Okay, first up, you've got regulation, sometimes called command and control.
Sounds direct.
It is. It's basically setting rules, setting limits.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not pollute more than X amount.
Like speed limits, but for pollution.
Kind of, yeah. The ResearchGate source framed it that way. A really clear example is car emission standards.
Right, we all know about those.
And interestingly, the data from the European Environment Agency shows we've actually made more progress with petrol car emissions than diesel, which sort of reminds you of the whole VW emissions scandal, right?
Yeah, the Dieselgate. Proving that just having the regulation isn't always enough. Enforcement is key.
Absolutely. So regulation sets a hard limit. That's one approach.
Okay, drawing a line. Got it. What's next?
The second big category is market-based solutions. These try to harness the power of the market itself to achieve the environmental goal.
Using the market's own logic in a way.
Exactly. And within this, a major tool is taxes, specifically Pigovian taxes, named after the economist Pigou. Or, for climate change, you hear about carbon taxes.
Okay. How do they work?
Well, the idea, as explained by the Tax Foundation source, is simple. You tax the activity that causes the negative externality. This increases the price.
So polluting becomes more expensive.
Right. It forces the polluter and ultimately the consumer to face a price that's closer to the true cost, including that external damage we talked about. Unlike regulation's hard limit, a tax makes pollution costly.
The more you pollute, the more tax you pay. Seems logical. But I remember reading about huge protests against carbon taxes, like the yellow vests in France. It's not always popular.
That is a huge point, and a real challenge. Economists might like taxes because they seem efficient, theoretically. But the social and political side is really complex.
How so?
Well, a big issue is fairness, or perceived fairness. Who bears the burden? Often these taxes can hit lower-income households harder as a percentage of their income.
Right, because things like fuel might be a bigger chunk of their budget.
Exactly. So what happens to the money raised by the tax becomes incredibly important. Is it given back somehow, maybe as rebates? Is it invested in green alternatives? That redistribution aspect is critical for public acceptance.
So it's not just the tax itself, but the whole package deal around it.
Okay.
What other market-based tools are there besides taxes?
Another really important one is tradable pollution permits. You might hear this called cap and trade or an emissions trading system, ETS.
Cap and trade. Heard of it. How does that work?
Okay, so the cap part is key. A government or authority decides on a total limit, a cap, on how much of a certain pollutant, like CO2, can be emitted in a region over a period.
So a fixed total amount of pollution allowed.
Yes. Then they issue permits or allowances, and the total number of these permits adds up to the cap. These permits are then allocated or auctioned to companies that pollute.
Okay, so companies need permits to cover their emissions.
Right. And here's the trade part. If a company figures out how to cut its emissions cheaply, maybe below the number of permits it holds, it can sell its spare permits
To
another company that finds it more expensive to cut emissions and needs more permits to cover its pollution.
I see. So it creates a market for the permits.
Precisely. The total pollution is fixed by the cap, but the system lets the market find the cheapest way to achieve those reductions overall. Companies that can cut easily do so and sell permits. Companies that find it hard buy permits. The price of the permit reflects the cost of reducing pollution.
Interesting. So it sets the quantity of pollution allowed and the market sets the price, whereas a tax sets the price and the market determines the quantity of reduction.
You've got it. That's a good way to put it. And it's really, really important here to make a distinction. Our sources were very clear on this. Cap and trade, ETS, tradable permits.
Yeah.
This is not the same thing as carbon offsetting.
Okay, that's a crucial clarification. Not the same. So let's talk about carbon offsetting then. We hear about that a lot. Offset your flight's carbon footprint. What's actually going on there?
Right. Carbon offsetting is typically a voluntary action. It generally involves paying for projects somewhere else that are supposed to reduce or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to compensate for your own emissions.
Like planting trees.
Planting trees is a very common example, yeah. The idea is the trees absorb CO2. Our lecture notes actually mentioned a classroom exercise on trading permits, specifically to contrast it with offsetting.
So what's the key difference or the key concept with offsets?
The absolute critical concept, highlighted everywhere, especially in that YouTube link, is additionality.
Additionality, meaning?
Meaning that the emission reduction achieved by the offset project would not have happened anyway without the money from selling the offset credit.
So if you pay someone to not cut down a forest, but they weren't going to cut it down anyway, that's not additional.
Exactly. It has to represent a new additional reduction in greenhouse gases that wouldn't have occurred otherwise.
And
Proving that, well, that's where it gets really tricky.
Right. And that seems to be where a lot of the criticism comes in, doesn't it? The media has definitely picked up on questionable offset projects.
Absolutely. Offsets can be valuable if they're done right, rigorously verified, genuinely additional. But the system is definitely open to abuse, greenwashing.
Greenwashing, yeah. Making it look like you're taking action without really achieving much.
Precisely. And that article about EasyJet's offsetting attempts was quite revealing.
How so? What did it show?
Well, it looked at different types of projects EasyJet invested in. Things like protecting forests from deforestation. But the article noted issues with methodologies and even concerns about carbon colonialism.
Wow. Okay. That sounds problematic.
Then there was investing in a UK offshore wind farm, more local, better data perhaps, and even investing directly in carbon capture technology, which is, much closer to the source of the emissions.
And the impact, the
Yeah.
credibility.
Hugely different across these types. And the cost to EasyJet to actually neutralize its footprint varied enormously depending on which type of offset they chose. Some were cheap but questionable, others were more credible but way more expensive.
That really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Offsetting isn't just one thing. It ranges from potentially shaky schemes to much more concrete actions.
It really does. It shows why careful scrutiny is just essential in that voluntary market. It's quite different from the more regulated systems like taxes or cap and trade.
You also briefly mentioned incentives like subsidies under market-based solutions. Could you just touch on those? Our sources didn't focus heavily there.
Yeah, subsidies are basically the flip side of taxes.
Yeah.
Instead of making pollution more expensive, you make the cleaner alternative cheaper. So subsidizing solar panels or electric cars, for example.
Makes sense. Encouraging the good stuff?
Right. But as you said, the focus in the materials we looked at was more on tackling the negative externality directly via taxes or caps.
Got it. So regulation sets limits. Market solutions like taxes and cap and trade put a price on pollution, and then there's voluntary offsetting, which needs that careful check for additionality. But you mentioned downsides to the market approaches too.
Yeah, particularly with cap and trade, some concerns were raised in the CSIS and World Economic Forum pieces. One worry, similar to the tax issue, is the impact on poorer households or regions.
Regressive effects, potentially.
Potentially, yes. Another is the cost for industry, especially energy-intensive ones competing globally. And that brings up the leakage problem.
Leakage. What's that?
Leakage is when, because one country or region puts a price on carbon through a tax or cap and trade, a company decides to just move its polluting factory to another country without such rules.
So the pollution doesn't disappear, it just moves location. You plug one hole and it leaks out another.
Exactly. You reduce emissions here, but global emissions might not decrease or could even increase if the new location is less efficient. That's a major headache for climate policy.
And that's where something like the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism comes in, the CBAM.
Precisely. The CBAM is the EU's attempt to tackle that leakage problem head-on.
How does it work?
It's essentially a kind of carbon tax, but it applies to imported goods. If a company wants to import certain carbon-intensive products like steel or cement into the EU, they'll have to buy certificates corresponding to the carbon price those goods would have faced if they'd been produced inside the EU under its emissions trading system.
So it tries to level the playing field. It makes imported high-carbon goods face a similar carbon cost as EU-made ones.
That's the idea. Prevent carbon leakage and protect EU industries that are paying the carbon price already. It's controversial internationally, but it's a direct response to that leakage problem.
Okay, that's a really interesting mechanism. So we've got the economic logic, the market failure, the different policy tools, regulations, taxes, cap and trade, offsets, and even ways to deal with problems like leakage. Which brings us back to that third big question.
Why haven't we solved this yet?
Yeah. If the science is pretty clear and we have these economic tools that, economists largely seem to agree on, why does progress on sustainability, especially climate change, often feel so slow and painful?
It's definitely a complex mix of factors. Our lecture notes suggested 3 big interconnected reasons, though obviously there's more to it than just these 3.
Okay, let's hear them. What were the 3?
The first concept mentioned was hyperobjects.
Hyperobjects. Sounds like something from sci-fi.
It kind of does. But the idea, drawing from that Wired article, is that some problems, like global warming, are just so massive, so distributed across space and time, spanning generations and the whole planet,
Okay.
that they're incredibly difficult for us as humans with relatively short-term perspectives to fully grasp and react to effectively. It's hard to feel immediate, urgent danger from something so vast and slow-moving in human terms.
It's too big and abstract to properly scare us into action.
Something like that. It challenges our basic cognitive wiring, you could say. It's not like a tiger jumping out at you. It's this slow-motion, planet-wide crisis.
Okay. That makes a certain psychological sense. What was the second reason?
The second one was termed the cigarette playbook.
Right. I think I know where this is going, like the tobacco industry.
Exactly. The idea, based on those Wikipedia and BBC links, is that industries facing regulations that might hurt their profits often employ tactics similar to those used by big tobacco for decades.
Such as?
Well, Things like funding research designed to sow doubt about the scientific consensus, lobbying heavily against regulations, running PR campaigns to confuse the public, emphasizing uncertainty, basically delaying action for as long as possible.
So actively working to muddy the waters and block policies, even if the evidence is strong?
That's the argument, yes. Fighting a rearguard action against measures that threaten their business model.
Okay, so we have the sheer scale of the problem and deliberate efforts to obstruct solutions. What's the third factor?
The third one highlighted was the free rider problem.
Another classic economic concept.
Yeah, and that YouTube link explained it well in this context. For global problems like climate change, there's an incentive for individual countries or even companies or people to just not do their part.
Why is that?
Because reducing emissions costs money or effort. But the benefit of more stable climate is shared by everyone, whether they contributed to the solution or not.
So you can benefit from others cutting their emissions without having to bear the cost yourself.
Exactly. You get a free ride on their efforts. And if everyone thinks like that, hoping someone else will take the lead.
Then nobody does enough, or action is much slower than it needs to be.
Precisely. It makes international cooperation incredibly difficult because each country might be tempted to wait and see what others do first.
Okay, wow. So the problem is almost incomprehensibly huge. There are powerful interests actively fighting against solutions, and there's this built-in incentive for everyone to wait for someone else to act. That paints a pretty challenging picture.
It does illustrate why progress is hard-won. But it's also crucial to remember the flip side, the level of agreement that does exist.
You mean among scientists and economists?
Yes. Our sources emphasize the very strong consensus among climate scientists, that 97% figure often cited by NASA and others about the reality of human-caused climate change and the need to reduce emissions.
So the science is pretty settled on the basics.
Largely, yes. And importantly, there's also significant support among economists for using policy tools, especially market-based ones like carbon pricing. The MIT, SE, NBR links all pointed to that.
It wasn't just niche academic support either, right?
No, not at all. We saw that quote from Ernst Fair, a very respected behavioral economist, arguing in a major Swiss newspaper for pricing in environmental cost via CO2 tax.
Right.
And even The Economist magazine, which is generally seen as center-right and pro-market, has consistently argued in favor of a carbon price.
So mainstream economic thinking across different viewpoints often lands on needing to price these externalities.
It seems so. That broad agreement really underscores that the main obstacles aren't necessarily a lack of understanding of the problem or a lack of potential tools. The challenges are more in the implementation, the politics, the psychology, the collective action.
Okay, so let's quickly recap then. We started with the invisible hand and how it can fail when external costs, like pollution, aren't included in prices market failure.
Right, the core economic rationale for intervention.
Then we looked at the main tools. Regulation, or command and control.
Setting limits.
Market-based solutions like carbon taxes and cap-and-trade system.
Putting a price on pollution.
And also voluntary carbon offsetting, which needs that careful additionality check.
A more complex and sometimes controversial area, yeah.
We also touched on challenges like leakage and how things like the EU's CBAM try to address that.
Making carbon pricing stick globally.
And finally, we explored some big reasons why progress is often slow. The sheer scale of hyperobjects like climate change, the cigarette playbook tactics used to delay action, and the fundamental free rider problem in collective action.
A sobering look at the hurdles.
It really is. So we've covered the economic logic, the tools available, the broad scientific and economic consensus on needing action, and some major roadblocks.
A pretty thorough deep dive, I think. From the theory of externalities right through to the practical policy challenges.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering everything we've discussed, the clear economic logic, the strong scientific agreement, but also these really significant barriers like hyperobjects and free riding, what do you think is truly the single biggest obstacle holding back more decisive action on sustainability? And maybe more interestingly, what might be a surprising, perhaps unconventional way to start overcoming it?
That's a good question to ponder. There are no easy answers there.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.